The cream of the National Gallery's collection of 18th century French paintings fits into one room, but it is a delightful room. We'll survey in this lecture this part of the collection going by subject matter, starting with history painting, genre, and still life painting. Francois Boucher's approach to history painting indicates the significant differences between the serious history paintings of the 17th century and the oftentimes more lighthearted approach of the 18th century. Boucher, whose dates were 1703 to 1770, was a native of Paris who rose through the official academic ranks through sheer talent and charm. After his training, he went to Italy from 1728 to 1731. He entered the Royal Academy in 1734 and had his first royal commission in 1735. Boucher became the favorite painter for Louis XV's mistress, the Marquise de Pompadour, and in 1765 became first painter to the king. Pan and Syrinx from 1759 is a quintessential Boucher history painting, featuring beautiful female nudes, nature, water, and a subject about love. The ever-amorous god Pan has pursued the wood nymph Syrinx, but as a follower of the chaste goddess Diana, she has tried to escape him. At the banks of a river, she calls upon her fellow nymphs of the stream to aid her, and she is transformed into reeds growing at the water's edge. After hearing the sound made by the wind blowing on the hollow reeds, Pan assembled a musical instrument from them, his panpipes or syrinx, which would become his customary symbol and link him to Syrinx forever. This painting has none of the sad overtones of other tales of loss and transformation, however, because of Boucher's interpretation of it. While Pan grasps a bundle of reeds, Syrinx is still there, stretched out nude, her pose echoing that of the other nymph in reverse. Note the vase that helps to identify which is the river nymph. A Cupid flies above, holding a torch to suggest the burning nature of Pan's desire. Everyone seems to consider this erotic pursuit as having a touch of humor to it, not as a genuine threat. This is a long, long way from the history paintings promoted by Poussin and his followers. Boucher was a consummate artist technically, and this painting shows off his abilities to paint fluidly but with vigor. The colors are fresh and typical of the artist and of French art in mid-century in the 18th century. Some of his finest painting is found in details such as the flowers and on Pan's and the water nymph's leafy wreaths. While it all looks spontaneous, we know that Boucher, like his predecessors, prepared his compositions carefully. Preparatory drawings for the scene are still extant. It is not such a long way from this kind of history painting to the type of genre paintings favored in the century. Although Nicolas Lancret, whose dates were 1690 to 1743, first studied in Paris with a history painter, he soon discovered his talent for genre scenes, which gained him wide popularity. There are 9 paintings by Lancret in the National Gallery. A Lady in a Garden Taking Coffee was exhibited in 1742 at the annual salon sponsored by the Royal Academy. This charming scene of leisure may be a straightforward genre painting or one of Lancret's group portraits in a genre mode. It's debated by scholars. A family sits at the edge of a garden, and the mother offers a spoonful of coffee to the younger of the 2 daughters. Father watches the scene of mother and children with approval. Meanwhile, the family dog is digging in the flower bed to the right, but no one seems terribly concerned. Dogs will be dogs. The wealth of the family is emphasized through the male servant, the silver coffee pot and tray, delicate porcelains, and the elegant, expensive clothing. Note here the wrap protecting the younger girl's dress as she takes the spoonful of coffee. Indeed, the 18th century in Europe did see a burst of increased personal consumption. One message of the painting is about the socialization of children. While the young girl has left her doll behind only temporarily in her excitement at the offer of the coffee, soon she will abandon childish pursuits entirely for adult concerns. Indeed, her older sister seems, by her patient pose, halfway towards this goal already. The 18th century consistently associated women with nature. Thus, the fountain at the right, prominent flowers, and background of trees are closer to the 3 females than to the 2 males. And I have to point out, Lancret was not a brilliant painter of architecture, as the somewhat skewed perspective of the fountain architecture suggests. The relatively untamed nature of the setting beyond the fountain makes clear that the scene is not real. Gardens were shaped and pruned carefully at this time. Lancret's charm is his ability to depict all the details of this life with care and yet maintain focus on the human interactions at the heart of the scene. Jean-Siméon Chardin, whose dates were 1699 to 1779, was one of the most renowned painters of genre and still life subjects for nearly half a century. A Parisian by birth, like Boucher and Lancret, he studied with two different history painters, but from the beginning of his independent career, he concentrated on still life and later genre subjects. He entered the Royal Academy in 1728. While his subjects were humble, his clients were not, and included Louis XV and Queen Louise Ulrika of Sweden. The National Gallery owns 3 paintings by Chardin. The House of Cards from about 1736 to 1737, signed by the artist, is a fine example of his genre paintings that featured children and adolescents. This composition was popular, and Chardin painted several versions of it, as was his habit. Like many Chardin paintings, this has a deceptively simple composition. We see a young man, head in a profile view, body turned slightly more towards us, who stands at a table on which he is constructing a house of cards. He holds a card in his left hand, contemplating its placement, while others bent await him at right. A drawer of the green felt-topped game table is open. We can assume that he drew the cards out of this storage area. We look at this boy with the same kind of concentrated interest he exhibits in his pursuit. What does it mean? Is this simply a pleasurable scene of childhood games? Contemporaries of Chardin also painted this subject, and it was generally understood to be a metaphor of transience. The house of cards will suddenly tumble and the game will end. Thus go all human endeavors. Indeed, when the composition was engraved in 1743 by Bernard L'Épicier, it was accompanied by verses which asked, "Which is more solid, our projects or your house?" However, such verses were added by engravers and publishers without necessarily consulting the painter. We are relatively certain that this painting was exhibited in the Salon of 1741 with the title, "The Son of Monsieur Lenoir amusing himself in making a house of cards." This might change our reading of the painting slightly. As a portrait, it might, but did not need to carry the same load of symbolic meaning. Lenoir was a friend of Chardin's and a cabinet maker. Both men would appreciate the emphasis on careful concentration on a task, even a slight one. Indeed, we can imagine that this image provides a complement to Chardin's own concentration as a painter, one known to work slowly but methodically. Creating an illusion of life, as he did here, is its own house of cards. A false step as a painter can destroy the whole sense of reality. Fortunately, Chardin hardly ever slipped. Chardin only began to focus on painting genre scenes in the mid-1630s. His fame before that rested on his still life paintings. La Fontaine, from about 1733, is a hybrid likely painted during the period of transition, for it combines elements of both still life and genre painting. Like the House of Cards, this composition was painted several times. One version was shown in the Salon of 1734. The large copper water urn is one that starred in its own painting, now in the Louvre, from right around the same time. In that painting, it stood strongly lit among other copper containers and an earthenware jug. In the National Gallery's painting, it still plays a leading role at the center of the painting, but is now brought into a narrative. Within a dark room with a cobblestone floor, a female servant draws water into that same earthenware jug. Her bent posture and profile pose keep us from seeing her face, but the pose is eloquent in suggesting concentration on her task. This is a major theme of Chardin's. To the left, a joint of meat is hung on the wall, while a large copper pot rests on a barrel. At the right, we can see through an open doorway into another room, where a second woman looks down at a young child. Many of Chardin's genre scenes from the 1730s concentrate on humble scenes and tasks. What would his contemporaries, in many cases the same people who bought paintings by Boucher and Lancret, find so appealing in these images? Early critics, such as Denis Diderot, the encyclopedist, philosopher, and art critic, referred to the truth of Chardin's paintings. That seemed to mean that he didn't try to make the humble grandiose, nor pretend that a scullery was as bright and beautiful as a garden. Yet what happened there was still worthy of respect and suggested a kind of generalized bourgeois morality that found many admirers, even in a time of luxury. Chardin's style is completely in tune with his subject matter. He did not overly stress different textures or materials, and he did not use semi-transparent glazes. Rather, his oil paint draws attention to itself as paint, with which he imitates the world. The 18th century in France was a great age for personalities. Not surprisingly, then, portraiture flourished in this era with its emphasis on the individual and on personal consumption. We will look at 6 portraits now from the 1720s to the 1790s in order to get a sense of the range of portrait types, wider now than at any previous time we have studied. Hyacinthe Rigaud, whose dates were 1659 to 1743, was from Perpignan in southern France. He only came to Paris in 1681. Rigaud's most famous painting is a state portrait of Louis XIV from 1701, which exists in several versions. His portrait, Antoine Paris, from 1724, lets us see just what his sitters received with his grand style. The painting depicts Antoine Paris, Count of Saint-Pigny, and oldest of the 4 Paris brothers, who, though sons of an innkeeper, became major financiers at the start of the 18th century. The Paris brothers fell from power in 1726, however, 2 years after this portrait was painted. Rigaud here has used one of his favorite portrait concepts, the man in his study interrupted by a visitor. In keeping with the flattering nature of this large portrait, it measures 57 by 43.5 inches. The study Rigaud evokes is grandiose in scale. Consider the size of the column and the urn that frame Paris to either side. He sits at a gilded table in an elegant gilded chair, and judging from the gesture of his right hand, he appears to be acknowledging someone just outside the picture's space to the right. Meanwhile, though already richly dressed in at-home clothing, he clutches a dark blue velvet drapery around his midsection. The color harmonizes beautifully with the gold and brown tones of the rest of the portrait, but it does seem a little over the top. We need not accept any of this as real. Rigaud's clients would not have done so. This is clearly an idealized image of Paris, a representation that encapsulates how he would like to be seen. However, despite the grandiosity of pose, costume, and setting, Rigaud was still able to convey something about Paris himself, or again, something about how Paris wished to be seen. He looks resolute, intelligent, and not at all embarrassed by his bourgeois features. He is dressed in this relatively informal style with his unbuttoned shirt front. Such a combination of naturalism of characterization with the grand style was what made Rigaud so popular. This painting also has something we haven't talked about for many lectures now, an original frame. The frame's decorative vocabulary of scrolls and acanthus leaves derives from classical architecture, but here clearly is also meant to echo the detailing of the furniture within the painting. The frame also draws attention to how purposefully Rigaud centered Paris in the composition. If we jump ahead about 40 years, we see a very different portrait style had emerged. Jean-Baptiste Perronneau's Jacques Cazot, from about 1760 to 65, evokes a man of taste and wit who will be judged on his own merits. Perronneau, whose dates were about 1715 to 1783, is now not very well known, but he was a sensitive portraitist in pastel and in oil paint. Born in Paris, he trained in portraiture with Hubert Drouet. From the mid-1750s onward, he worked in a number of French cities and abroad in the Netherlands, Italy, and Russia. He died in Amsterdam, though he had continued to send work to the Paris salons during these various international sojourns. Perronneau seems to have responded sympathetically to his sitter for this portrait. Jacques Cazot was a well-born civil servant who was in Martinique from 1747 to 1759, working in naval administration. After his return to France, where he had inherited his brother's estate in Champagne, He devoted himself to writing early romance novels. He fell victim to the French Revolution and was put to the guillotine in 1792. It is better not to think of this sad end, however, when looking at this splendid portrait done some 30 years earlier, full of life on the part of the sitter and the painter. Cazot, in early middle age, holds himself erect, with his hat held casually under his arm. He looks off to the left with an expression of intense interest and good humor. Perronneau's use of highlighting on the face, most noticeable on the left cheek, the tip of the nose, and the forehead, helps to increase the sense of vivacity, as does the barely contained smile of the sitter. Such a portrait suggests that a talented portrait painter didn't need much more than the right sitter. The complementary colors of red in Cazot's coat and green in the background are used to great effect, and Perronneau's lively yet descriptive brushwork depicting the lace, gold buttons, and highlights in the coat keep us from missing any setting or larger concept for this portrait. The interest and dignity of the individual, an Enlightenment recasting of a Renaissance idea, stands behind such a portrait. Does that mean that the state portrait, as exemplified by Rigaud, no longer existed? Not really, though it had been modified some. Its usefulness as a means of personal propaganda for the major players in the state had not become obsolete, as indicated by the portrait of Madame de Pompadour at her tambour frame from 1763-1764. François Hubert Drouet, whose dates were 1727 to 1775, was a portrait painter who studied with his father and with Boucher, and who gained repute as a court painter. The full-length, grand-scale portrait that measures over 7 feet by 5 feet was the very last to be made of the Marquise de Pompadour, once the mistress to Louis XV and later his official best friend and advisor. Pompadour, named Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, was ennobled shortly after the start of her affair with Louis XV in 1745. She was always concerned with her public image and worked to control it through portrait commissions. While her favorite portrait painter was Boucher, in this case, Drouet offered her something different than Boucher's highly flattering images of her as eternally youthful. In the Drouet portrait, Pompadour seems more the kindly matron, seen at work over her tapestry frame and accompanied by her little black dog, than the politically powerful person she actually was. Criticized by many for undue influence over Louis XV, she sought in this and other portraits to dispel any sense of such authority through emphasis on her feminine virtues. She works in a luxurious setting in her apartment at Versailles, in what would be the equivalent of a man's study or library. Books are present here, but also a mandolin, and the wool, chalk, and drawings refer to her patronage and practice of various art forms, as would be appropriate to a woman of accomplishment. While Pompadour looks heavier than in portraits from just a few years earlier and was in ill health the last few of her short 43 years of life, she nonetheless appears at ease in this portrait, holding our gaze steadily as we interrupt her tapestry work. Her hand-painted silk dress with its elaborate lace decoration is the ultimate in contemporary luxury, but she wears it primly. An inscription on the work table tells us that the head was painted in April 1763, but the rest of the portrait was finished in May 1764, a month after the death of the Marquise. The head was in fact painted on a separate piece of canvas stitched into the larger portrait. This was not an uncommon practice, especially for the portraits of the most powerful sitters whose time was in great demand. Drouet had a meticulous style of painting which worked well to emphasize the private world of Pompadour. Compared to some of her other portraitists, his style also seems naturalistic. The likeness was remarked upon as a good one after her death. We move from this portrait of Pompadour to a self-portrait of a female painter. Elisabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun, whose dates were 1755 to 1842, was the daughter of a Parisian painter and the wife of an art dealer who rose on her own merits. She was accepted into the Royal Academy in 1783 as one of only 4 women allowed to belong to the Academy at a time. Her clientele was associated with the French court, and she was the favorite painter of Marie Antoinette. At the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789, Vigée Lebrun left the country with her daughter, traveling and working in Italy, Russia, and Central Europe until 1802, when she was allowed to return to France. Near the end of her life, she published her memoirs, which provide a nearly unprecedented glimpse into the life of a highly successful painter who was a woman. Vigée Lebrun's self-portrait in a straw hat was painted after her trip in 1782 to Belgium, where she had seen Rubens's portrait of Susanna London, then in Antwerp, which we saw back in Lecture 14. She painted one version while still in Brussels, then this autograph copy on canvas shortly thereafter. What had she responded to so strongly in the Rubens portrait? The pose, of course, the somewhat informal costume, and the intimacy of the portrait. But Vigée Lebrun was also intrigued by Rubens's painting technique and imitated his use of multiple layers of paint, some semi-transparent. The wonderful combination of reflected and direct sunlight on the face and creamy bust did not escape her attention either. Her many changes are also significant. Here she truly does wear a chapeau de paille, or rustic straw hat. To emphasize its country airs, she has painted fresh flowers on it, in addition to the ostrich feather. Vigée Lebrun faces us straight on and from a greater distance than Rubens' sitter. While her glance is friendly, she holds her palette and brushes, reminding us of who is in charge. The painting is not only meant to complement Rubens, it is meant to compete with him. Vigée Lebrun was known as a fashion trendsetter. She not only painted her sitters wearing looser dresses and natural hair rather than powdered wigs, she actually pioneered such a style in real life, and the aristocrats followed her lead, and we see her modeling this style in this self-portrait. It is perhaps an irony that more natural attire was an innovation of a court ruled by rigid etiquette, but it also suggests a brief moment before the French Revolution when a number of women played key roles in French cultural life, not the least of whom was Vigée Lebrun. Another portrait by a lesser-known artist encapsulates a certain moment in time and a certain kind of art patron. Henri-Pierre Danlou, whose dates were 1753 to 1809, was a pupil of Joseph-Marie Vienne, an important history painter in Paris. He traveled with Vienne to Rome in 1775. Danlou returned to France in 1783, but did not settle permanently in Paris until 1789, probably not a good time to choose. So, as a royalist, he left France for England in 1792, painting both French émigrés and British sitters, before returning to his native land in 1801. Danlou's The Baron de Besenval in his Salon de Compagnie from 1791 was purchased in 2004 by the National Gallery. And at once we can see why, for it certainly helps to flesh out our understanding of a time and place. The sitter was typically for Danlou an aristocrat, but perhaps more interesting than some of the painter's other patrons. Swiss by birth, Pierre Victoire de Besenval was a member of a military family long in the service of the French crown. He served as commander-in-chief of the Swiss Guards of the French king, but fled his post with the storming of the Bastille and was briefly imprisoned. We see him here in comfortable retirement in his Parisian townhouse during the last years of his life. Among court and artistic circles, Besenval was well known as an art collector, not just as a soldier. A 1787 guide to French art collections has allowed scholars to identify the paintings hanging on the wall behind the Baron as ones in his collection. They are all 17th century works by Dutch painters and one Italian master. On the mantel are various Chinese Celadon porcelains in European gold mounts, while a large mirror reflects other paintings hung across the room. Besenval sits happily in a wing chair next to the fireplace, resting his elbow on its carved side in an unusually informal pose. A few more Chinese porcelains sit on a tall chest behind that chair. The style of decor was by this time about a generation out of date, but that did not seem to matter to Besenval. Danlou evokes the contentment of a public man now in retirement, content to sit and think among his treasures, ones that suggest wide-ranging interests and tastes. Perhaps best for him that his life ended in relative security before such persons were looked on by a new government with distrust and even hatred. We will turn last to an artist who allied himself with the revolutionaries rather than the royalists, despite having received royal patronage himself. Jacques-Louis David, whose dates were 1748 to 1825, was the most influential artist of his day as leader of the neoclassical movement and the most sought-after teacher in Paris. Trained like Danlou by Vienne, he also went to Rome in 1775, where he remained until 1780. With his full entry into the Royal Academy in 1783, he was quickly successful as a history and portrait painter, obtaining commissions from Louis XVI's government. With the outbreak of the French Revolution, however, he sided with the revolutionaries and even became a deputy to the new convention in 1792. With the many twists and turns of who held power in this period, he was twice imprisoned in 1794-95, but was later rehabilitated with the rise of Napoleon in 1799-1800. After Napoleon's final defeat in 1815, David went into exile, moving in 1816 to Brussels. The portrait of Jacobus Blau is signed and dated fourth year of the Revolutionary period, or 1795. The paper Blau writes on carries his name and title, Minister Plenipotentiary of the States General of the United Provinces. Blau was himself a revolutionary. He was among the Dutch party called the Patriots, who in 1787 had rebelled unsuccessfully against the authoritarian rule of the Stadtholder William V of Orange. In 1794, a French army, encouraged by the Patriots, successfully invaded the Netherlands. A client state of France was set up, and a new government christened the Batavian Republic in Holland. Blau arrived in Paris in 1795 to work on treaty terms between the two countries, which were established very much at the convenience of France. Years later, at the end of his diplomatic career, Blau would settle in Paris. There was genuine sympathy between sitter and artist, and a letter from Blau to David after receiving the portrait thanks the artist for his friendship, even more than for his likeness. The painting conveys calm and dedication. Blau has looked up for a moment while he ponders, his brow slightly furrowed. The clear colors and precise but non-dramatic presentation of the sitter suggest to the viewer that the sitter was straightforward and trustworthy. Only the lightly brushed background lends any drama to the painting and helps to create a sense of atmosphere and space for the figure. How unrevolutionary such a painting seems, yet how much it departs from the conventions of the state portrait. David wanted to remake that idea just as well as he wished to remake government itself. Many in England watched the events of the French Revolution with horror, remembering their own country's painful regicide in the 17th century. Fortunately for English aristocrats, however, the 18th century was a relatively peaceful time, at least inside the nation, and it turned out to be a glorious era for English painting. In our next lecture, we will consider some real masterworks of English art, beginning with the subject of portraiture.